Welcome to the Addendum, a thing added. On this podcast, Pastor Eric Williams will add to, clarify, and supplement the most recent teachings at Fellowship Renewed Church.
Yesterday, I introduced William Wilberforce, and the reason I did that is because we're studying Psalm 119 and committing it to memory, well, at least the first 8 verses. And I thought I'd take a couple of minutes today and just cover the highlights of the life of William Wilberforce. Thought that would be relevant and applicable to us. So William Wilberforce, if you're not familiar with him, or maybe you remember learning about him in the past and forgotten some of those details, a few things about him that are helpful for us and encouraging and interesting. William Wilberforce was born in 1759. He was born in Hull, England, and he was born to a wealthy merchant family. William Wilberforce had a lot of money, and he was, for lack of better terms, very pampered and spoiled in his life. And that will show itself as he starts to age. Well, his father died in 1768. All right, so he was born in 1759. His father died in 1768. Okay, so he's 9 years old. And he went to live then with his aunt and uncle who lived in London. His mother was sick, couldn't care for him. Of course, she was going through a lot of pain and struggle herself with the passing of his father. And so she wants to make sure he's cared for. Well, his aunt and uncle don't have any children of their own, and so they're very welcoming to that idea. So this is a very important, pivotal moment in William Wilberforce's life. So this is very relevant to what would happen in his future. So he moves and he lives with his aunt and uncle for a couple of years, not very long, but those couple of years that he stayed with them proved to be very meaningful and impactful. So his mom was not very religious, but committed to the church in England, and didn't like the idea of this uprising of what was called at the time Methodism. A little bit different than how we'd use the term today, but basically it was just for dissenters from the Church of England, reformers in their own right, in a sense, but basically just evangelicals. And so there was a movement of these people at that time, and his aunt and uncle were part of that movement. And so you've heard of George Whitefield, I'm sure, and he's associated with this movement. Well, turns out George Whitefield was friends with William Wilberforce's aunt and uncle. And so he actually had dealings with him and heard George Whitefield preach. And this made an impact on him. He liked what he was hearing and what he was experiencing, and he started to drift over into this reality and this movement. Well, his aunt and uncle were also friends with, or had association with, another guy. His name was John Newton. And John Newton, we know John Newton because he wrote a very famous song. The song he wrote was Amazing Grace. That's at least what we call it. And John Newton had a very complicated life of his own. And William Wilberforce is very young at this time. And in the future, William Wilberforce will encounter John Newton again as he's a bit older. But as it is right now, John Newton's life was very complicated in itself. He was converted, John Newton, was converted in 1748, and before this, he was working for the Royal Navy. He had worked on slave ships. He had a life of, he had a hard time. People didn't really get along with him very well, long story short, he eventually is converted in 1748, but that was his past. Well, he continued to work on slave ships, and he actually captained some slave ships at that time. And he did that up until 1764. So he's converted in 1748. He continues to work with these slave ships, actually captaining slave ships until 1764. But in 1764, he was actually ordained as a priest. Now, up through that time, he began to be more persuaded of a certain reality, as you can imagine, as his heart was changing. And he was a lay minister for a time. And so there's this crossover with John Newton's life. And he eventually began to speak out against the slave trade and wanted it abolished. But in 1772 is when John Newton wrote the hymn Amazing Grace. It was actually originally titled Faith's Review and Expectation. He wrote it in 1772 for a sermon he was preaching in 1773. It was a New Year's Day sermon. And so it was thinking about the past and looking forward into the future as we start a new year, where things have come from, where things are going, and how faith is working. So if you read Amazing Grace in that light, it's kind of eye-opening to see the context of that song. We don't know the original tune of Amazing Grace also. The tune that we sing today was put with the song in 1829. So anyway, all that to say, how that converges with William Wilberforce is that he had these figures in his life that he was exposed to, and it was just a couple of years of his life when he was young. And so William Wilberforce's mom at this time realizes that he's being indoctrinated and led astray, in her opinion, to these Methodist beliefs. And so she takes him back. She's recovering. She's feeling better. She takes him back into her care, but she actually makes sure that he's going to a school that's more in line with how she thinks he ought to be raised. So he finishes out school and then goes to college at Cambridge University in 1776. That's probably an easy year to remember. So we know what was happening here in the U.S., 1776. And at that time in history, that's when William Wilberforce enrolled in college at University of Cambridge. All right, so while he's in university, he is really living it up as a rich party boy. That's all he's doing. So those couple of years of influence and pulling him toward the gospel and being exposed to these things, well, after a period of time, that becomes part of his past. He has fully embraced the party lifestyle. All he wants is to enjoy life to the fullest and goof off. And he even reflects on the fact that he didn't ever study. He didn't ever give his attention or time to things of substance that really mattered. I think you get the idea, right? He had the party college experience. And so he graduates, though, in 1780, and he is elected as a member of Parliament. All right, you got to remember, he's born in 1759, and now it's 1780, so that means that he is 21. And he's elected as a member of Parliament. And of course, they think that he's very, very young. But you know what? He had lots of money, and people liked him in general. He was very gregarious. People liked him. He liked people. He liked being around people. He had a great singing voice, and he was very well known for that. So anyway, he just also he had a lot of money. And so he would throw big, elaborate parties and things like this. So anyway, people liked him. And so because of that, he was elected as a member of Parliament. And he was intelligent. He was intelligent as well. 1784, 4 years later. So he's gone to university, Cambridge. He's lived it up. He's partied. And then when he was elected as a member of Parliament, he actually continued to live that same lifestyle. He was just a partier. nothing was really all that serious. And then 1784, over a period of about a year and a half or so, conversion takes place. And it all begins when he took a trip with some friends, and the friends that he went on this trip with, they happened to be Christians. And so him and these Christian friends go, and they end up having conversation, and they expose him to certain Christian writings, some of the Puritans, for example. And so he starts reading this, and there seems to be this point of connection for him with those few years in his childhood. And now, as he's starting to mature and think more seriously and realize that his life is frivolous ultimately, that he begins to think about the truth of the gospel. And it's over this period of time. At some point, that's when conversion occurs. And so now, though, he's got a problem of his own in his mind, that now he works in politics, but now he's a committed believer, and he doesn't know how those two worlds can exist together. So what he wants to do is he wants to quit politics, and he wants to just be a minister in some capacity. So he thinks that he needs counsel on this, and he wants to hear from someone who's legitimate, someone he can trust. And who does he remember? He remembers John Newton. And he says, I know John Newton. Actually, he lives very near where I am and where I visit here in London. And so he makes this secret trip to see John Newton. And he ends up visiting him a few times, but he ultimately asks him, what should I do? Here's what I want to do. I want to be like you. I want to be in ministry. I want to pursue the Lord in that way. And John Newton counsels him and says, you really just need to stay doing what you're doing and serve the Lord where you are. You need to take what the Lord has given you in your platform, and you need to use that to the glory of God. And that's convincing to William Wilberforce. And he says, yes, I think you're right. I think I can use my platform and where I've come and where I am by the providence of God, and I'll take that and I'll use it to the glory of God. Well, as William Wilberforce is growing in his faith, he's maturing, he realizes two big things. Number one, he realizes that his life has been lived in immorality, and he needs to change that. Just generally his own morals, his values, what he's doing, what he's saying, how he's living. And then number two, he's convinced of an evil that exists in the world, and that is the slave trade. And so he has kind of a dual purpose mission when he's going to reform himself, and he's going to reform this practice in the world of slave trade, at least in Great Britain, because that's where he had influence. So he sets out to see what he can do. So in 1789 now, so that 1784, 1785 is his conversion. 1789 is when he introduces his first bill to abolish the slave trade. And it's not received well at all. People don't really want to hear what he has to say, for the most part. People don't really want to hear what he has to say. He's laughed at, he's mocked, things like this. Well, it kind of continues that way for 18 years. For 18 years, he will struggle, continuing to present bill after bill and doing all this work, at one time traveling and using some people offer their help and support, and they get this petition signed by all these people, and they do everything they can, everything in their power. And he's sick along the way, and he has other struggles and things like that. Well, eventually in 1792, so that's a few years later, he actually moves to London. See, he was traveling before. He moves to London. And he moves pretty near Parliament, because that's where he's doing all his work. That's where his energy is. That's where all these things are taking place. And it's at this time in history when he commits Psalm 119 to memory, and he recites it as he walks from his home to Parliament committing his life to the Lord. So I hope that inspiration settles in for you as it did for me. It's very inspiring. The way he was committing these things to his heart, but it wasn't just his heart. It was his heart, and it was overflowing into his life and everything that he was doing. Things move on, and just to bring the story to a close for today, things move forward. He commits himself to all these realities, and in 1807, Parliament finally abolishes the slave trade. He is successful in his endeavors. That is 1807. Now, the slave trade ended, but all those people who were slaves still had a slave status, and so that was still not acceptable. And so work continued. Well, just months before William Wilberforce died in the year 1833, the Emancipation Act is passed in Great Britain, and he's able to hear this just before he passes away. So that's the life of William Wilberforce in a nutshell, and I hope it's encouraging and inspiring to you.
Thank you for joining us on the Addendum podcast. For more information about Fellowship Renewed Church, visit frcsparta.com. Please join us for next week's episode.